Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Faith Unraveled, where we discuss the chapter of life after a big awakening. I'm your host today, Alicia. This is my first episode ever being solo. I thought I would just sit down and take a little time to describe my own personal faith journey, how I went from being an active, believing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to completely losing my testimony. I feel like this story is most fun if we rewind back to October 11th, 1997, which was the day that I got married. Jamie and I got sealed in the San Diego temple. Afterwards, when we were at our reception, our videographer handed my mom the microphone and asked her to speak words of advice to the new couple. This is what my mom said into the microphone. Jamie and Alicia, at some point, you're going to come to a fork in the road. When that day happens, Alicia, you go your way, and Jamie, follow her. Literally exactly what happened. After 21 years of callings and baptisms and temple trips and word council meetings and PPIs, every other thing imaginable that you do as a member of the church, I found myself in a rabbit hole of church history, and my testimony was unrecoverable. I had found the CES letter. At that period of time, I was actually preparing to become a seminary teacher. My stake president reached out to me. He said, "Hey, Alicia, I heard this is like something that you would want to do. Let's talk about it, maybe for this fall or next fall. What do you think?" I told him, absolutely. I loved my time working with the youth. I was a young women's president when I was 28 years old. I went on to do lots of fireside talks, loved helping the youth develop a testimony of Jesus Christ. It was my life's work for sure. So I knew that taking this calling as a seminary teacher was going to be a big deal because living in California, seminary is not a job. It's not part of the CES employment. It's a calling. Each day before school, you are together with the kids for roughly an hour. You're teaching them about the gospel and you are strengthening their testimony. And the idea is that kids do this for the 4-year span when they're in high school so that they're having this strengthening of their testimony before they go and face the fiery darts of the adversary at their high school campuses. I said to my stake president, and this is just over text. This was not a formal calling. This is just a text. And I said to him, this year is going to be tough because my little guy isn't quite old enough to stay home by himself. But if you give us another year, then if it's an early morning that my husband has to leave before I get home, he'll be okay getting himself out of bed. But we need another school year. I said to myself, in the meantime, what I'm going to do is prepare myself significantly for I'm going to cleanse the inner vessel. I'm going to dedicate my life to studying the scriptures as well as I can, really dedicating a lot of time to my gospel understanding. One of my kids was at a charter school that year. So I would actually drive him to seminary in the morning. He would get a ride to school and then I would pick him up at noon. But from the period of time that I dropped off my youngest at school until I picked up my older child at noon from his charter school, I devoted that time to gospel study. On this one particular day, I was driving to pick up my son from school. This thought occurred to me. It was the first time that this had really occurred to me. I was thinking about the construct of sin. And I was thinking about how everything that I know about a loving, conscious parent on this earth, because you're taught as a Mormon that your heavenly Father can be thought of as like an earthly father too. A lot of the same characteristics. The divine qualities of a loving father in heaven are also found consistent with a loving father here on this earth. So I started thinking about that and I thought, all the features of a very loving father are consistent with accepting the child as they are. Kind of this idea of no bad parts. You'd never see a very conscious, loving parent say to their child, you can't come home unless A, B, C, and D. What you would see that with is maybe a narcissist parent, maybe a parent that is emotionally immature. Like if you're not this, this, and this, you can't come home. It just started dawning on me, we are attributing these features of a very intolerant father to God, who's supposed to be the most conscious, loving human being in the entire universe. How does this work? The prayer that I said as I was driving to my son's school was, Heavenly Father, please help me understand the construct of sin. If you are a loving God, as I've known you to be, Wouldn't you be perpetually forgiving, perpetually loving, perpetually unconditional? Wouldn't you think beyond my shortcomings? Wouldn't you see the best in me? I don't understand how this construct works with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when I asked that question, I was essentially asking, is the church actually true? And that's what I realized as I was having this moment of pondering. I was like, wait a second, is this true? And I'm kind of going in this circle until suddenly I realize if it wasn't true, what I want to know. I took a moment. I didn't respond to that immediately. I kind of made an agreement with the universe, with my inner self, with God. But I said, yes, I want to know. And if this is not true, I want to know. That following weekend, I was in New York and I saw the show Wicked. If you haven't seen the show Wicked, it's the story of Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West. In Dorothy's story of Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West is a complete villain, but we really know nothing about her. All we know in the Wizard of Oz is that the Wicked Witch, she's an evil person. She's a wicked person. She has guile in her heart. She wants to destroy. She wants to take away your peace. She wants to take away your happiness. And in the story of Wicked, we learn about Elphaba, who she really is. We learn about the stories that were configured to make her look wicked, to make her look like the villain that we had all accepted her to be. I'm sitting in the audience, and in the first scene that Elphaba enters the stage, she runs on and she sets down her suitcase. I lose it. Now, I had seen this show several times. I'm kind of an enthusiast for the show Wicked, so I'd seen it a number of times, but I just started weeping, uncontrollably weeping, where it was affecting my breathing and affecting my daughter's ability to watch the show peacefully. She was like, what is going on with you, Mom? I had no idea why I was weeping until a few days later when I discovered the CES letter. And I realized that the story of Elphaba, the story of the Wicked Witch, is also the story of the wicked apostate. He and she who have strayed away from the covenant path, written in as the true villain, the real one and only true villain in this life. There isn't a criminal on this planet that can reach beyond the wickedness of someone who has accepted the gospel and then left it. It is the one unforgivable sin. And in this moment of discovering the CES letter, I realized that was a curated narrative because the experience that is the faith deconstruction sits on concrete evidence, historical truths, a rewritten past. Those who leave the church are not wicked. They are concerned with truth and goodness. What they have discovered is a box of Mormon history, a book of Mormon that was not translated the way that we were taught, a book of Abraham, which was not in fact an ancient Egyptian translation, a first vision story that had changed several times since the original, temple ceremonies which were created to teach the saints about secrecy as church leaders were instituting polygamy with young girls, many of those girls who lived in Joseph Smith's home as foster children. The experience of living as an apostate, someone who has accepted the gospel and then rejected the gospel, it is not because of their evil or wicked hearts. It is because they have discovered the box and they have looked inside the box. After reading through about the first 3 chapters of the CES letter, I decided to open up my scriptures to Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, which is the section of Mormon scripture that outlines polygamy and Mormon heaven as we believe it. According to Joseph Smith, this is from Jesus Christ. It basically says that Jesus will destroy Emma if she does not accept this law, celestial marriage, which is polygamy. You have to know what was going on during that period of time. Joseph Smith has already proposed to numerous young girls. You've got Lucy Walker, who lived in his home as a foster child. You have Fanny Alger, who had lived in his house as sort of a helper when she was young, like 15 years old. These were the girls that he was approaching and declaring that they needed to either accept his invitation to be sealed to him or the gates of heaven would be closed to them and also to their families. So in the case of Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14 years old, she writes in her journal that she was devastated that this was the the worst thing that could happen, and that she was devastated to see her friends and her brother and people that she loved that were her age be able to go off to dances and to date and to do all these things that were consistent with being that age at that time period, and how devastating this would be that this had come to an end for her. But she knew that this is what she needed to do because this was the Lord's path. This was the covenant path. And looking at these things as someone who's a mom, devout, reading these things, what they did is they made me realize, just seeing it all in one place, that this organization had essentially started as a cult organization, not different from a lot of other cults that have existed. And if you look at the patterns that existed with Joseph Smith and his persuasiveness and his coercion and his charm, and just seeing this like preponderance of evidence that painted him essentially as a cult leader. And that's tough information to grapple with, especially when you look at what the church has become today. The members of the church who are kind and generous. How could this possibly have started as a cult? When I saw the issues with the Book of Mormon translation, when I saw the issues with the Book of Abraham, polygamy, these are all topics that have been substantiated on the church's website. You can look at the Gospel Topics essays, you can look at the Joseph Smith Papers project and see that these things have in fact been substantiated. Now, when they originally came up, the historians that brought them to light, some were excommunicated for that. Even faithful members of the church who had testimonies, but they were discovering these things. Eventually, the church came around and they funded this Joseph Smith Papers project, which compiles all this historical evidence of polygamy. It's something now that the church accepts, and it's no longer considered an anti-Mormon lie. Neither is the reality that Joseph Smith grew up as a little treasure seeker. Then he would use this magic seer stone to tell him where the treasure was buried. See, these things when I was growing up were considered anti-Mormon lies. I have an experience even of Elder Holland telling my friend as a missionary that that was an anti-Mormon lie and that the adversary was working hard to discredit the church. And now what we know is that those are all part of history. Where I came up with this is that the church is not true. Like the way that President Hinckley presented it is it's got to either be true or a fraud. That was how it was presented to me my entire childhood. So now what do I do with this information? Because now I can see this wasn't true, this wasn't true, this wasn't true. And many of these things were demonstrably false. The Book of Abraham was taught to me to be an actual translation of an ancient Egyptian record, that papyri. And what it really was, what we know now, is that it was a funerary scroll. And it does not say anything of what is recorded in the Book of Abraham. So the church has tried to reconfigure this by saying, well, it was still an inspired word. Don't you feel the Spirit when you read it? But here's the thing. Now, if I'm going to continue being a member of this church after discovering all of these things, there's going to have to be something good here. Second phase of deconstruction is looking at the goodness of the church. There's an account on TikTok called Choose the Left. They outline this. The church has either got to be true or good. And when it becomes not true, then you have to say, well, is it good? As I started to dive into that, it did not take very long to realize that the policies that were written into the church to keep Black members of the church unable to hold the priesthood until 1978, that is a harmful policy. It is harmful that people in the church of color believed that they would be white in the next life because part of them being perfect would be to not have their dark skin. That is based on doctrine that is in the Book of Mormon. That is not something that can be erased. The skin of blackness as compared to white and delightsome. Very harmful. When I looked at the policy that was written in November, I believe it was 2015, that would keep children of LGBTQ people from getting baptized and from serving missions. It would keep people who were from polygamous families from serving missions or getting baptized. So as I started to look at all these things and I looked at how the church had persuaded me to get involved with things like Proposition 8, which would ensure that gay people could not be married, when the church started to get involved with politics in this way, I just realized this is not an organization that is good. And so now it's not true and it's not good. And where does that leave me? So my husband came home from work the day that I read the CES letter, and I just started crying in his arms. I said, I cannot believe I'm telling you this, but the church isn't true. I discovered it today, and I need to show you all the things that I've found. I don't know what to do with this. And he just kind of held me and like kind of almost chuckled and was like, it's going to be okay. What I didn't realize is that he had started discovering some of these things before I had. And he had already discovered about the Book of Abraham, Helen Mar Kimball, and he had tried to talk to me about it, and I was not in a place to accept this information. What I also did not realize is that my mom had completely deconstructed in 1993 after reading a book written by Fawn Brody, who is the niece of David O. McKay. And that was a book that outlined all of these things that the church is now owning up to. She wrote about it back then and was very vilified, very vilified. Talk about alphabet. What I realized is that I've got already people in my camp. I've got already people who know and understand this stuff. And at that point, Jamie was not willing to walk away from the church just yet. He wanted to continue to go because he saw the value in the community. He saw the value in the friendships, and people wanted our kids to have that influence. So we had planned that he would continue to go and I would go if I could stomach it. The idea of not being with my kids on Sunday, sitting with them on the pew, really hurt me. So for a couple of months, I continued to go with them. And I sat in the back of class, and I was no longer raising my hand during gospel doctrine. I was no longer raising my hand during Relief Society. Felt very sick being at church during those months. And then March of 2020 hit, and that was COVID. At that point, we transferred over to Zoom church meetings, which meant I was out of there. There was no reason for me to go to a Zoom meeting for church. Church was only about being with my family at that point. Jamie continued to go to those meetings for probably around 6 months. He at that point decided to step away because between the time that I approached him in November of 2019 and probably the following 12 months, he started to dig into a lot of the materials that I had discovered. And he at one point just realized this is all shit. And at that point, we decided to walk away from the church. And that is my story of my Mormon faith deconstruction. And my friends, I just want to thank you for coming on this journey with us. There are so many topics that we want to continue to explore with you, how we grapple with family and friends, spirituality, and all the many phases of anger and rage and gratitude and fear, and how to balance it all after a faith crisis. It's so difficult. So I want to invite you, if you haven't already, to dive into our Deconstruction Series, which goes through these different areas of faith deconstruction. I hope that whether you have been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or another faith, or had some kind of awakening at some point, that this content will resonate with you. I am so grateful to connect with you on this journey, and thank you for joining me today on this episode of Faith Unraveled. As one more follow-up, please come and find us on Instagram, where we are faith.unraveled. And if there are some topics that you would like to hear, please send me a DM. I check my DMs on the daily, and we've gotten lots of great suggestions for episodes. We also have a Q&A series that we call Faith Unfiltered, where we give you a real live reaction to your questions. And those have been some of my favorite discussion points for this series. So can't wait to hear from you. And thanks again for joining me on Faith Unraveled. Take care, friends.